With the fall campaigns in full swing, new reports out today show official Democratic Party organizations have outraised their Republican counterparts this year. Their current cash on hand, $75 million to $55 million, reflects that. But those numbers only skim the surface as outside groups begin pouring unlimited amounts of money into critical races without always disclosing where it comes from. That includes two nonprofit groups headed by former White House aide Karl Rove, which alone have already raised $32 million. Joining us now to explain how the political money landscape has changed this year are Kenneth Gross, an elections law specialist and attorney in private practice in Washington, and Bill Allison, editorial director for the Sunlight Foundation, a nonprofit group that promotes government transparency. It seems that there's more money coming out, but less transparency, but less knowledge of where it's coming from. Am I correct in that?
You are correct. What is happening, the landscape, the way it's changing, is we're seeing more 501c organizations, nonprofits.
Which means nonprofits.
Exactly. Yeah. C4s, issue advocacy groups that are not required to disclose their donors in most cases, and in a number of instances don't even have to disclose their expenditures if it's an issue advocacy type expenditure.
Bill Allison, in the past we've seen a lot of groups who pour money into campaigns. They're not necessarily nonprofit groups, so they have to disclose. Is that the distinction?
There are Section 527 organizations which are nonprofits, but
like say the
political
Swift Boat
nonprofits.
Veterans for Truth
Exactly.
that we've talked about so
right.
much.
And there were several. MoveOn.org was another one, was a 527. They have to disclose their donors to the IRS, and they file electioneering communications, independent expenditure reports with the Federal Election Commission. But we are seeing a lot of groups that have been taking advantage of different loopholes in the system or holes in the system. To give one example, just after the Pennsylvania primaries were over, a group called the Emergency Committee for Israel started running ads against Joe Sestak because it was more than 60 days away from the general election.
Who's the Democratic nominee?
Democratic nominee, right, for the Pennsylvania Senate. They're more than 60 days away from the general election. They can run those ads without filing anything with the Federal Election Commission.
Where is the Federal Election Commission in this? You used to work at the Federal Election Commission. Are they supposed to be bird-dogging this, watch-dogging this, making sure that we know where the money comes from and where it's going?
The Federal Election Commission has made it fairly clear, at least that there is not a majority of votes on the commission to delve deeply into the activity of not-for-profits, particularly these 501c4s. They're giving wide berth to the C4 activity. And one of the keys of the expenditures that we're seeing now as a result of the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, is that the expenditures have to be independent expenditures. And whether they're independent gets into this issue of whether there's any kind of coordination between these groups and the campaigns. And the FEC has struggled mightily to try and even define what coordination is. So it's a tough issue for them.
Ken Gross mentioned the Citizens United decision where the Supreme Court basically kind of opened some of the floodgates, some people think, but it wasn't about disclosure, it was about who can give how much money. Have we been able to measure yet whether there's been any impact of that decision?
The one thing that we can say is that if you compare where we were in the midterms in 2006 and the midterms now, it's around 57 million, I think, based on FEC figures that we've so far been able to count in 2010 cycle. This is from January to the present. In 2006, it was around, it was about $20 million less, about 37 million. So clearly, we're seeing a lot more money being spent on these types of ads. Now, to the extent that we've seen corporations jumping in and actually running ads on their own, that hasn't really happened yet.
There was one example where Target Corporation put money into a Minnesota race and it backfired on them, just publicity-wise.
But if you think about it, though, corporations have always been able to give to some of the types of organizations, the 501c4s, the 527 groups, and certainly the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the biggest players in terms of electioneering communications. They're the top spender of electioneering communications so far in 2010. And none of that money has to be disclosed. That's another one of the 501c groups, the C6 actually.
Okay, flip side, you mentioned the Chamber of Commerce. What about the unions? We've always heard that's what the Republicans always say when the finger is pointed at them. They say, well, there are the unions out there who benefit the Democrats.
The unions, after this decision came down, the Supreme Court decision back in January, actually jumped into the fray a lot quicker than the corporate community. They went in with both feet because one thing that this opinion does allow is for unions to directly make independent expenditures. Previously, they had to go through the security of giving to third parties themselves, and they had the flexibility of spending the money, the dues money that was on hand, and it'll be interesting to see the numbers at the final analysis, but the unions might be matching the corporations.
Well, that's the question. Who is benefiting more from these new kinds of fundraising? Are the Republicans benefiting because they're getting money raised and donated from groups like Karl Rove's, or are the Democrats benefiting because they've always had this institutionalized benefit from the pro-democratic labor movement?
Well, I hate to say it. I think the answer is yes.
I set you up.
Both sides are clearly benefiting. And when you get to the labor unions too, I mean, they can do express advocacy. They're running ads in Arkansas saying vote against this candidate or vote for this candidate in the Arkansas Senate race with Bill Halter and Blanche Lincoln, who ultimately prevailed. It is, we are seeing just an unprecedented flood of corporate money, or labor union money, corporate money, and outside money influencing elections.
So if you're a candidate, or you're someone who's interested in supporting a candidate, and or you're just a voter who is not involved in this at all and is trying to decide who do you believe, how can you find out when the situation is so murky right now?
It's very difficult, particularly to determine who's spending what in a timely fashion. When it comes to the candidate spending itself, yeah, you can look that up on the FEC reports, but when it comes to trying to figure out what a 527 is expending, you have to go to the IRS. Whether it's a C4, you may not see it at all if it's just issue advocacy. This is very tough for any average citizen, not to mention a member of the press, trying to write about it. And I don't know that we're getting the kind of disclosure that we would like to see.
The name of your organization is the Sunlight Foundation. You tell me, how's it going? The Sunlight.
Not as well as we'd like. One of the things that we're trying to do, we have a website called sunlightcam.com where we're asking people to report on the ads that they see so they can at least track it. When you do put an ad on television or the radio, there's some basic information the station has to track on it, so at least you can find out sponsors. I mean, I think that one of our big concerns that goes kind of beyond the federal level is that there were 20-some state laws that were wiped out as well by Citizens United. A lot of states don't have disclosure mechanisms in place, and when you think about judicial elections and some of the state races, there can be a flood of corporate or labor union money with no tracking, particularly like proposition money, something about ballot measures and things like that. So this is a big concern. What we've done is create this website where people can report that they're seeing something, so at least a reporter can go back and say, well, gee, I can go to that TV station, radio station, and find out what's happening.
Today there was a Tea Party group that had a press conference down at the National Press Club here in Washington. They announced they've been given $1 million from an anonymous donor, and that this was going to go into campaigns between now and November. Is that an example of what we're talking about? Because there's not just one Tea Party organization. Can several of them just get these kinds of donations and do what they want with it, and we don't necessarily know?
That would be kind of tough. I mean, if they're actually putting money directly into campaigns, they become a political committee under the election laws. They could possibly do it as an independent expenditure effort, and even there, depending on how they do it, they might have to disclose their donors. But this is an area where you really need to get into the weeds of the law, because generally speaking, if they're going to be trying to turn money right into a campaign, they're going to have to disclose that.
And most people aren't going to be getting very deeply into those weeds, but thank you for helping us with that. Bill, Allison, Ken Gross.
Thank you.